to our series of podcasts on monarchy in peril. I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney, Australia, and a Director of the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub.
And I'm Robert Aldrich, a Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
In these podcasts, we're looking at some of the crises that shook and sometimes overturned monarchies around the globe in the 19th and 20th centuries. In this episode, we look more closely at colonialism, which is one of my and Robert's special interests. In fact, we've edited several books on the topic of monarchy and colonialism, including one entitled Crowns and Colonies. So where do we start? Well, from the 15th century or so, several European nations began to arrive in the Americas and quickly came into conflict with indigenous dynasties, including the Inca and the Aztecs and others. Europeans also soon began making inroads into Africa, including through the notorious Atlantic slave trade. And then there was Asia, where valuable commodities such as spices, tea, porcelain, and silk quickly attracted European attention. And merchants, trading companies, and eventually governments rushed in to extract as much profit as possible. But the Europeans didn't just walk in to monarchies around the world. They often encountered powerful resistance from local emperors and kings in places like India, China, Japan, and elsewhere. Some of these monarchs were able to resist the European onslaught. But by the late 19th century, Europeans claimed as colonies huge amounts of territory in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. And countries like Britain and France were not the only ones involved. Indeed, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands had amassed large overseas empires in the first period of expansion in the 15 and 1600s. Then Belgium, Italy, Germany, Japan, and the United States entered the fray by the late 1800s. And by the late 19th and early 20th century, Russia had spread to Central Asia and Siberia, and the Chinese had secured their hold over Tibet and other frontier areas. Now, many of the countries that expanded overseas were monarchies. Indeed, all of the European ones by the late 1800s, except for France, were monarchies. And so too was Japan. Kings and queens generally supported colonialism, and they very much profited from it. After all, conquests gave them more lands over which to rule. In 1876, Britain's Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, and she was very proud of this title. And by this date, she reigned over something like a fifth of the world's entire population in a truly global empire. Her peer, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, reigned over the vast and rich Dutch East Indies, what we now know as Indonesia. Perhaps most notorious of all, King Leopold of the Belgians established his own private colony in the Congo in Central Africa. And the Belgian Congo was actually more than 70 times the size of the home kingdom Belgium. But Leopold was not alone. By 1910, the Japanese emperor reigned over Taiwan and Korea. And after Italian troops invaded northeastern Africa and conquered Ethiopia in the 1930s, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini grandly proclaimed the Italian king Emperor of Abyssinia, another name for Ethiopia. Now, the rule of Europeans over many of their distant domains would prove relatively short-lived. But, at least for a while, colonies provided status, resources, and money for monarchs and their subjects. Now, Robert, what can you tell us about the emperors, kings, maharajas, chiefs, and others whose lands were taken over and whose peoples were subjected to foreign rule?
There were huge numbers of indigenous rulers around the world, and many of the countries had one or another type of hereditary monarch, although the titles differed, as did the powers. But all of them did have military, judicial, financial, and spiritual power. And in fact, we need to understand the bases and the activities of these monarchs to understand the dynamics of imperial conquest. As European soldiers, adventurers, administrators swarmed around the world, they raised flags and took over territory. That usually involved coercion and violence. Some of the indigenous rulers were killed in battlefields as they resisted Europeans. Many who survived continued to resist. The Europeans, nevertheless, left some of the monarchs on the thrones in what were called protected states. What the Europeans were really protecting were their own geopolitical and commercial interests. But nevertheless, they realized the importance of the local monarchs as interlocutors and as symbols of their own peoples. Yet they could get rid of them when necessary. As I've written about in a book called Banished Potentates, rulers who continued to resist the Europeans or who became involved in rebellions or whom the Europeans simply thought of as being incompetent or immoral were dispensed with. For instance, in 1857 in India, when the last Mughal emperor, who by that time only ruled over a small territory, was involved in a rebellion that the British called the Mutiny, but Indians now see as the First War of Independence. The British reacted. They dethroned the Mughal emperor and they exiled him and his family to Burma. In a slightly odd parallel, in 1885, when the British were taking over the part of Burma that they didn't already control, they toppled the king there and sent him and his family into exile in India. And so on it went, as this provided a strategy for the British, for the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, to overturn dynasties, abolish thrones, and thus try to stamp out resistance. So might made right in the colonial world, and European monarchs ended up reigning over many territories where there were no longer dynasties or where the dynasties had effectively been reduced to auxiliaries to European rule. Although sometimes the idea of monarchy and even the institutions of monarchy lived on and would play a role in anti-colonialism in Africa and Asia and Oceania.
Well, now let's look more closely at one region where many indigenous monarchs paid a very heavy price for the interests of European monarchs, namely the Pacific Islands, those islands so fabled in the European imaginary for tropical luxuriance and the fantasies of erotic exoticism. We're joined now by Dr Lorenz Gonschor, a senior lecturer at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, who's also taught at universities in Hawaii, Tahiti and Tonga. So he knows the history of monarchy in the Pacific Islands well and has published widely on the international history of these countries.
This interview was done over Zoom, so listeners may notice some differences in sound quality in various parts of the podcast.
Lorenz, thank you for joining us. Firstly, can you tell us something about the rulers in the Pacific before the arrival of the European colonizers?
First of all, it is kind of important to understand that Polynesia, as much as it is maybe linguistically and culturally relatively closely related, the different archipelagos, their traditional political system by the time of Western contact was actually quite different from archipelago to archipelago. So in some areas of Polynesia, you had more something akin to maybe chiefdoms or village communities headed by by a village chief, or you had like village councils. You had kind of more of a decentralized system, in which I guess probably the Western term monarchy would not really be the fully appropriate term. It would rather be somewhere between like chiefdom, tribal, aristocratic. Maybe some of that would fit, but certainly not monarchy. However, there were two Polynesian archipelagos, Tonga and the Hawaiian Islands. There were indeed very centralized systems of government that Europeans readily identified as kingdoms. And they were certainly quite comparable to other forms of indigenous monarchies in other parts of the world, like Asia and Africa and others. In Tonga, we had a archipelago-wide unification from maybe about as early as 1000 AD or so onwards, with the Tu'i Tonga, a kind of a sacred dynasty descendant from the gods, supposedly, in charge. Later, it was somewhat sidelined by a side branch that actually ruled the archipelago, which is also the ancestors of today's Tongan monarchy. In the Hawaiian Islands, these four kingdoms that existed at the time of first Western contact were then quickly after contact all conquered by one, namely by the Kingdom of Hawaii Island.
So clearly there were a number of different dynasties around Oceania. What was the fate of the dynasties and their rulers as the Europeans and Americans began to take over their realms?
There were three ways in which colonizers would engage indigenous monarchies. One was to just proclaim these indigenous monarchies to be a protectorate, but leave them essentially alone internally. And that happened in Tonga. So that's why the Tongan monarchy still survives. Second type of colonial engagement with indigenous monarchies was essentially to force them under a protectorate first, but only as a first step in order to later take them over completely and abolish the indigenous monarchy. Now, that was the strategy that France used with Tahiti, and actually not just Tahiti, but some of the outer islands in French Polynesia, or what is now French Polynesia as well. The third option goes into the opposite direction, and that's the New Zealand Maori case, where there was no centralized monarchy before Western context. There was not one during the early post-contact period either. But after the British had taken over New Zealand, with some consent by some Maori through the Treaty of Waitangi, after the British colonial regime became more and more unbearable for Maori, some of the Maori tribes then bonded together to create a monarchy, essentially as an anti-colonial resistance strategy. And that's where we have the formation of the Maori monarchy, which is also still with us today. That was essentially a kind of an initiative that was against the colonial regime. And for a certain part of the 19th century did de facto rule certain parts of the North Island quite independently of the British colonial regime.
And what about Samoa?
Samoa did not really traditionally have a centralized monarchy. However, it had essentially 4 high chiefly titles that had a high level of significance throughout the entire archipelago, including some concrete political power that came with those titles. In the 19th century, they were attempting to create a constitutional monarchy in which somehow these 4 title holders would be kind of balanced out, and at least one of them would temporarily be king of Samoa. Now, that did not always function really well because colonial powers were playing off these different title holders against each other. Eventually, then, Samoa was divided between the Americans and the Germans. Germany received the bulk part of Samoa, like 2 big islands that make up about 90% of the archipelago. Germany institutionalized some of these high chiefly titles and kind of put them into a German administrative colonial system. So they actually proclaimed the kingship of Samoa.
You're listening to Monarchy in Peril from the University of Sydney, and today's guest is Lorenz Gonschor.
What about Pacific monarchies nowadays? And in particular, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the role of monarchist movements in places that are no longer monarchies, such as Hawaii, which is a really interesting case study, I think. What is the legacy of monarchies and royal families in the region?
Indeed, a very important legacy of monarchies in the Pacific. I already mentioned that Tonga has survived to this day as a monarchy. There are also still officially recognized sub-state monarchies in the Pacific, and that is specifically in the French overseas territory of Wallis and Futuna, or Uvea and Futuna, where we have a French territorial government, but we have the indigenous kings. They're actually called kings by the French, roi in French, the kings of these 2 islands that are actually considered kind of local rulers, somewhat of an equivalent maybe to a mayor in a normal French administrative system. In places like Hawaii, the monarchy was completely sidelined by the U.S. Invasion and U.S. occupation in the late 1890s. Of course, there is no official monarchy anymore. The legacy, or like the remembrance of that, is very strong. And for example, the Royal Palace in Honolulu is one of the most sacred buildings for Hawaiians. There are indeed strong movements to restore the Hawaiian monarchy from an international legal point of view, in which it's actually been found that the United States has no real claim under international law to have ever dissolved the Hawaiian kingdom. It's just kind of essentially an act of force, or like an act of occupation. So that's kind of one of the legal arguments for like the return of the constitutional monarchy.
And what about Tonga, which is the only reigning monarchy that survives in the South Pacific Islands?
Tonga is the only remaining Polynesian monarchy that is still today in control of a sovereign state and a UN member. the monarchy, despite some popular democracy movements that existed in the 1990s and 2000s, which have forced the monarchy to democratize and be less authoritarian. These reforms were essentially completed about 10 years ago. So it has lost some of its political powers that it had, but it certainly is still very popular to be at the helm of the state. And I think the Tongan monarchy is there to stay. I don't see any significant movement for like a republic as the only monarchy. It also does play, I think, an important role in supporting monarchist movements elsewhere. That is something that is often overlooked, but there are some actually very close ties of friendship that connect the Tongan royal family with both the Maori monarchy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, also the Kawananakoa family in Hawaii, and also the Pomare royal family, led by Joinville Te Ihinoi Atua, the heir to the throne of that family, who is also close to the current Tongan royal family. So in a way, the Tongan monarchy plays that kind of pivot to keep like monarchism in Polynesia alive today.
Thanks very much, Lorenz. Well, as we've heard, colonialism frequently involved violence and warfare. The New Zealand wars between the Maori and the British, and the Tahitian wars with the French, for instance. Warfare is another crucial topic in world history, and in the next podcast, we'll be talking about some of the effects of war on European monarchies. And in particular, we'll see how the First World War brought down several of the grandest and oldest monarchies in the world. But we'll also go behind the scenes and probe some of the intimate family relationships between many of the members of the ruling dynasties of the day. Thank you for joining us, and please tune in again next time for our next podcast from the Modern Monarchies in Global Perspective Research Hub.
This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The text of the podcast were written by Associate Professor Sidney McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldrich. And the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.